I'd like to begin with a little bit of math. Every one of you has 2 parents, which leads to 4 grandparents. And how many great-grandparents? And how many great-great-grandparents? And how many great-great-great-grandparents? And we could keep going to 64 and 128 and on. Did you ever stop to think how many people had to get it right for you to be here this morning? Perhaps when you had dinner together early this week, as I'm sure many of you did, you didn't look around that family gathering and begin to think how many more people had to get it right to have that many people gathered around the table. We often think life is simple and simply about ourselves, but it takes a lot of family for us. And this is a time of year when we tend to think about family. Not only do we tend to think about family, but many times we begin to tell stories about our family. And this morning, I have a story for you. This man doesn't mean anything to you. It means something to me. But during the Depression here in the United States, this man died in Texas, leaving 2 sons to run the lumber yard and sawmill in Palestine, Texas. He was only 55 when he died. The older son would go on to ruin the lumber mill, the lumber yard in town, and the younger son, at the age of 19, took over 20 employees to run the sawmill and promptly ruined that as well. Now, all of this matters to me because that man right there was my great-grandfather. And the son that he brought into this world, James Polk, would go on not only to lose the sawmill, he would then run the Loma Linda University farm and later the Pacific Union College University farm. But I remember him most from the town of Loma Linda, where he drove the city bus. One of the first times I actually remember him, he brought the city bus in front of the very house I lived, stopped, opened the door, and said, "Go tell the inside that you're coming with me." I ran inside, came back out, and I boarded the bus for free. And the next hour and a half, I toured around the town in the bus behind my grandfather until he came to the same street and opened the door, and that was my end of my visit with grandfather. Perhaps I remember that event because it was one of the few moments I actually had with my grandfather. I remember he was missing a couple of fingers, probably from something that went wrong in the sawmill, but I never had the chance to spend with him to learn about it. Now, that's not because the man died young. Rather, it's because in having 4 children but only 2 grandchildren, he always had something else to do besides spend time with his own family. Now, you would think with only 4 children and only 2 grandchildren, that would be an awful lot of time for each grandchild. But in fact, if I think about it very much, I cannot remember more than maybe 250 hours of my life that I spent with him. He was just a little too busy with me, or too busy for me. Not only too busy for me, he really gave me little in life except my mother. There was no big gifts. In fact, the biggest gift I remember is a box of old books. And I did read the books because I wanted something to do, and I had lots of time on my hands because I didn't have him engaged in my life. Now, I didn't come here just to tell sob stories about my family, but I came here to tell you that there is a larger family that doesn't treat you this way. Jesus expressed, when some came to see his family or to tell him about his family, Jesus expressed that everyone who does the will of my Father, that is my family. Which means I'm here with my family this morning. Which means when this past week I was at the barber and he began to talk to me about God and obeying God, I found another family member. Which means we find family members around the world. And the family is quite large. Now, family likes to get together and have meals together, and there is a family meal I'm looking forward to. It will contain more than just myself. But before I get to that, I want to address for a few moments how much Jesus has invested in you and me. Unlike my grandfather, Jesus formed us. Jesus designed us from the beginning. Ellen White writes, in fact, that he has sent a guardian angel to each one of us. Every redeemed one, when we are arriving at heaven, she writes, will understand the ministry of angels in his own life. The angel who was his guardian from his earliest moment. The angel who watched his steps and covered his head in the day of peril. The angel who was with him in the valley of the shadow of death. Who marked his resting place, who was the first to greet him in the resurrection morning. Perhaps you didn't think about that. An angel just to spend time with you your entire life, and when you are resurrected will be the first one to greet you. That is family. What will it be to hold converse with him, that angel, and to learn the history of divine interposition in the individual life, of heavenly cooperation in every work for humanity taken from education? That's family that invests in us. Then God gave us the ability to make an income, to make wealth. And he gave us himself and his very life. And then ultimately, he gave up his life for us. That's what God has invested in us. Which is why he too is looking forward to that meal together. In fact, he talked about it before he left earth. You remember the disciples were gathered there in the upper room, and as they're gathered in the upper room, Jesus says, I will not eat of this Passover until I eat it again at the family reunion. I will not drink of this cup. I will not drink of the fruit of the wine. And the word used in Matthew is until the day. You'll see it there. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in the kingdom, in my Father's kingdom. Now, that's the first time in human history when the whole family will be together, which means it will be a large family reunion. A large family reunion that will require some preparation. A large family reunion that others have looked forward in this world, not just us and Jesus. Which brings us to the 14th chapter of Luke. Jesus is having dinner with a group of people there, and someone didn't like his point very much and wanted to distract the situation, and so he says, blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of heaven. Now that's a true statement. And it is something that we look forward to. Blessed when we are part of that family reunion. But Jesus didn't take it and leave it there. There was something that concerned Jesus. And we're going to spend the next few minutes exploring that together. Jesus tells a story, as Jesus liked to do. A certain man made a supper, and he invited people to the supper. And they agreed to come, and then when it was time and everything was prepared, and the cooks that are here among us this morning understand this. It's not just invite someone and they show up. There's a lot of hard work that goes into preparing that for that moment. And the moment comes when it is prepared and the man sends out his servants. Now it's time to come and have dinner together. And you would think a big family reunion, you want to go to it. But unfortunately, I suppose I should turn that way. Oh, there we are. Oh, here I speak about preparation. Let's see. And they all with one consent began to make excuses. The first one, I just bought a big piece of property. I'm an investor. And I'm a little too busy in my investments to come to this dinner that I agreed on. The next one, he had 5 yoke of oxen. He was a businessman. He had his tractors, his new tractors, and if you've ever bought some new vehicle, you know there's lots of buttons to push and some kind of experience to have. And he wanted to go out and try those 5 yoke of oxen. And the last one, he didn't even go so far as to ask to be excused. He just explained, I'm married and I can't come. Now, ladies here, I'm sure that if your husband says, I can't go because he's going to stay and have dinner with you and listen to you, you would be very happy. This isn't always an excuse. But in the story, Jesus uses it as an excuse because many times we use family as an excuse. Notice now that all of the excuses that have been offered here had no basis in an emergency. The man didn't say, my ox is in the ditch and I have to go get him out. My daughter is in trouble and I have to get medical attention for her. It was, I just bought something and I want to play with it. In fact, probably every one of these people went and had dinner instead of doing whatever the excuse was. It wasn't to get out of dinner. They weren't going to go play with the oxen instead of dinner. They just preferred to have dinner at the same table, the same people, the same routine, and have more time in the evening to do what they wanted. It's funny how we make excuses. Now, if I were to ask you, I'll be kind, I won't, but if I were to ask you this morning how many of you make excuses, I suppose that every hand would go up here today. Perhaps you have an excuse why you came late to church this morning, or why you didn't have time to read the Bible this morning. Or we have excuses around this time of year as to why we just gained weight or are going to lose weight, or why we don't have time for one part of the family because we have to spend it with the other part of the family. We have, all of us, our excuses. And we make these excuses to all sorts of people. But let's look for a moment at the specific excuses that were there. The investor. Is it wrong to invest? After all, Jesus invested in you and me. And he wouldn't ask us not to invest when he invested. Was the problem the investment? God loves investors, does he not? The problem was rather using the investment to ignore God. It was a problem of priority, not a problem of action. Right? The same with the business person. It's not wrong to do business. In fact, whatever we do, we should do heartily and as unto the Lord and not to men. We should do good. The problem was not the business. The problem was placing the business instead of God himself. The problem was not the marriage. God is the one who designed family and gave us such joy in our family. The problem was rather that family became more important than God himself. Which leads me to the question, what do you spend your time doing? The average person lives about 73 years. If we take all of the time they sleep, babyhood, at night, when they're in their 70s and take naps, 1/3 of their life is given over to sleep, as the bottom bar there shows you. But when you go up a little further on it, the next most significant block of time there, the second one, is watching television. 8 years of life. The third block up there, 6 years and 8 months of life, is on social media. Think about it for a moment. 6 whole years of your life, you're going to be looking at a phone or a screen or something like that, which is more than the 3 years and 7 months above it spent in eating. If we add our working life, another approximately 11 years of life, and our education, another 4 years of life, if you put all those hours together, you come up with an almost complete picture of a human life here. And yes, ladies, there's 2 years there allotted for shopping and a year for housework. Now, if we spent 15 more minutes every morning and 15 minutes every evening and come to church every Sabbath, that would add to this 3 years out of our life spent with God. That's just 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes in the evening for an average lifespan and coming to church. Do we have time for God in our lives? Again, it's not the business and not the investment and not the marriage. It's our unwillingness to find time for God in all of that. Those of you who spend time on social media, that's almost everyone these days, you can see what percentage of it most people spend on different platforms. Christ object lessons, none of the excuses were founded on a real necessity. The man who must needs go and see his piece of ground, I don't know what we did there. The man who must needs go and see his piece of ground had already purchased it. His haste to go and see it was due to the fact that his interest was absorbed in his purchase. The oxen too had been bought. The proving of them was only to satisfy the interest of the buyer. The third excuse had no more semblance of reason. The fact that the intended guest had married a wife need not have prevented his presence at the feast. His wife also would have been made welcome. But he had his own plans for enjoyment, and these seemed to him more desirable than the feast he had promised to attend. He had learned to find pleasure in other society than that of the host. He did not ask to be excused, made not even a pretense of courtesy in his refusal. The I cannot was only a veil for the truth, I do not care to come. All the excuses betray a preoccupied mind. To these intended guests, other interests had become all-absorbing. The invitation they had pledged themselves to accept was put aside, and the generous friend was insulted by their indifference. Now let's reflect for a moment. Jesus didn't tell this story because it was interesting to talk about a meal at that time. The original statement is it's going to be blessed. We want to be at the family reunion in heaven. And it was at that moment that Jesus paused and said, yes, but the people who I want to be with me in the family reunion, you don't want to come. Did you ever realize that the hardest problem God has is your will and your attention? He has infinite wisdom and infinite knowledge and infinite strength and power. And he can solve any problem in the human universe except that he invited people to the family reunion. And they always have an explanation why they don't want to go. We have an explanation why this social media event or this social event or that work is more important than the quiet moments that God asks for. God help us. Finite, fallen human beings in need of pardon and peace, and all are invited to come. The Lord Jesus, the great teacher, gives the invitation, but often it is met with frivolous excuses or turned from with jesting and contempt. All who will may come and respond to the gracious invitation. Why cannot people see the importance of accepting the call and making their peace with God? The heart not given entirely to the control of Jesus Christ has a door open for Satan to enter, and the arch-deceiver weaves about the soul ingenious apologies in performing its hidden purposes of evil. All these excuses and pretensions are seen of God and are as spider webs in the eyes of him who never slumbers or sleeps. The next time you're walking along and you bump into the spider webs, as tall people like I do, our excuses are like spider webs in God's eye. Oh, how readily will the human soul find poor and wretched excuses to deceive and cover up its own course of evil which it pursues. There is an exact judge who weighs actions. He cannot be deceived, neither can he be mocked. He will one day strike off the covering, unveil the conscience, and sweep away these excuses as smoke. The excuses urged for refusing the invitation to the feast cover the whole ground of excuses for refusing the gospel invitation. Men declare that they cannot imperil their worldly prospects by giving attention to the claims of the gospel. They count their temporal interests as of more value than things of eternity. The very blessings they have received from God become a barrier to separate their souls from their Creator and Redeemer. The love of God will never lead to the belittling of sin. It will never cover or excuse an unconfessed wrong. It has to do with all our acts and feelings. It follows us and reaches every secret spring of action. By indulgence in sin, men are led to lightly regard the law of God. Many conceal their transgressions from their fellow men and flatter themselves that God will not be strict to mark their iniquity. But his law is the great standard of right, and with it, every act of life must be compared in that day when God will bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil. Purity of heart will lead to purity of life. All excuses for sin are vain. Who can plead for the sinner when God testifies against him? There is no excuse for sinning. Which leads us to the great problem that God has. How can he get us past our own excuses? In fact, the easiest way you and I will lose our eternal life is just to make excuses. But let's look at the same story in a different place. Matthew chapter 22. The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son, and sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. Again, he sent forth other servants, because of the excuses of the first ones. Tell them which are bidden, behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready, come unto the marriage. But they made light of it, and went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise. And the remnant took his servants, and entreated them spitefully, and slew them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. Then he saith to his servants, the wedding is ready, but where are they that were bidden? But they which were bidden were not ready, not worthy. Go ye therefore into the highways, and as many as you shall find, bid them to the marriage. So those servants went out on the highways and gathered together as many as they found, both good and bad, and the wedding was finally furnished with guests. What will be your priorities this afternoon, this evening, tomorrow morning? My grandfather had the wrong priorities, and I suffered as a consequence. And I'll spend a moment addressing some of the other excuses I've experienced. A different great-grandfather was an alcoholic, and that meant more to him than his own family. I have a friend right now. Tells me that every morning, as he's getting ready to leave for work, his wife finally shows up from the dancing and the partying the night before, just to take care of the children long enough for him to be at work so she can leave and go back to her dancing and party. The marriage doesn't matter to her. The children don't matter to her because she can't take care of them when she spent half the night partying. Her own pleasure matters more to her than her own family does. But I'll tell you another story that is interesting to me. John and Mary, 150 years ago approximately, owners of a home, and he was a businessman. And the arrangement was she took care of the two young children at home. He worked at the business, and he brought her the money, and she paid all the bills. And every month she would come to him, and we need money for the coal, we need money for the food. She would present what the bills were, and then he would give her money. But John liked his own reputation as having a lot of money in the bank account more than he cared about the needs of his own family. And so he would give her, if she asked for $5,000, I put it in today's money because then it was not near as much. If he asked for $5,000, she asked for $5,000, he would give her $4,000 and say anything more than that's going to bankrupt us. Now there was plenty of money in the bank account. But that was his mindset. I need to be someone who has a big bank account so I can brag to my friends. And one time, the wife, Mary, asked again for the bills, and "Oh, well, do you only need this? Don't you need more than this?" he said sarcastically. "Well, yes, the furniture is worn out, the drapes need replaced, the gate's broken, the fence needs painted. Yeah, there's other things." And he pulls the money out of his pocket and slams it on the table and tells her that he's going out of town on a business trip and he'll be back in a week. But lo and behold, when she looks at the money, back then, there was $1,000. More than enough money to cover everything that she has asked him for that morning. And since he gave her the money, she wasn't going to waste it. After all, he had told her as he left, "Do the best you can with it." And she would. So a week later, when he comes back from his business trip, he has trouble recognizing his own house. The fence has been painted, the gate has been fixed. He comes in and the drapes have been replaced, and there's even new clothes on his children. And he asks his wife, "Where did this money come from?" "Well, when you left, you gave me money and said, use it wisely. And I think I have." At which moment he starts to feel, and in exasperation says, "Oh, I gave it to you out of the wrong pocket." And then he goes into his usual spiel about how this is going to bankrupt the family, even though it obviously wouldn't. But at that point, his children came round and began to thank him for all of these presents that they had been told Father gave to them. And it's hard to be angry with your wife when your children are that happy for the presents they receive from Papa. And so in silence, he had to accept what had happened. And he began to look around, and the truth be known, he liked the house better. And the children did look better in a clothes without holes in them. And over time, he began to realize that there was a better plan in life, and whenever he started to be tough on his wife again, she only had to ask him, "Didn't you take that out of the wrong pocket?" And it had a profound effect on his conscience and his soul. I've spoken about excuses this morning, not because I want to make us feel bad, but because sometimes when it comes to God or each other, we've been pulling things out of the wrong pocket. And it leads to a certain kind of slavery. After all, we are slaves either of God or sin. That's the only options out there. As much as you think you make your own choices, you are either the slave of God or sin. We don't always stop to think about selling ourselves into slavery. It used to be common. We talk today about slavery, and we only think about the slavery where you were born into it. But many of the slaves actually sold themselves into it. They were poor. They didn't think they could do as well in life. They would choose to be a slave rather than live under a bridge, is what people do now. They would sell themselves into slavery. What price would you sell yourself into slavery for now? Well, every time you eat what you know is not healthful, you've just set the price of your slavery to your appetite at comfort. I want comfort, and that is so much to me, I'm willing to sell myself into slavery to my own stomach. Every time we choose to do something based on other people's opinion, other people's praise, we have just sold our own character and integrity in order to have the applause of other people. What is your price and my price? What is it that we've set ourselves for and we're willing to be slaves just to work a few more hours so that we have a little more prestige in the community? Or whatever our slavery might be. Many of us are slaves just to our own habits and our own past. Jesus responded in the same chapter in Luke, "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, yea, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple." Now that has to be one of the most difficult passages in the scriptures. Jesus is, after all, the author of love, is he not? Doesn't he teach us to love each other? Why would he say we cannot be his disciples, we cannot actually be part of his family, his kingdom, unless we hate all of the people he has taught us to love? I would submit to you this morning that Jesus doesn't contradict himself. It's not the hatred of the individual. It's the hatred of the distraction. Can we separate those two? It's not the hatred of the individual. In fact, true love to the individual will lead us to see them in the proper relationship to God and to ourselves and the rest of the world. And then Jesus told this following stories. Which of you goes to build a tower? I suppose, Julian, it's not a tower but a house for you. For some of the rest of you, maybe John, it's a building at Moriah Heights. Which of you goes to build a tower and doesn't stop to calculate beforehand how much it's going to cost? Because if you start to build something and you don't finish it, it's like that mall that they were going to build in Elk Grove, and then it sat there for years unfinished, and we all had to laugh about it. Or perhaps, Jesus says in another parable, it's like a king who's going to go out and march against another nation. Don't you stop to ask whether my 10,000 soldiers will be able to overcome 20,000 from the other nation. Or when the United States is going to go to war somewhere, will they actually be able to achieve a victory? Jesus asks us, have we calculated the cost? In our modern language, we call that budgeting. Have we budgeted for our future? And the future he's talking about is that great family reunion at the end, remember? Have you and I budgeted into our future what it takes to be there at the table that Jesus serves in heaven? After all, we budget for our finances. We budget for our time. Why wouldn't we budget for eternity? Why wouldn't we ask ourselves, what really does it take to be there first and foremost? And then set everything else, our time, our attention, our affection, based on that budget. Every one of us this morning here has our price. But unless you are willing to pay the price that Jesus asks, you won't be in heaven. And it will be because you didn't set your eternal budget and live by it. Which brings us back to Jesus himself. Jesus set goals, and he did whatever it took to achieve the goal. Essentially, that's what it says in Hebrews. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He was willing to sacrifice to do what it took for that goal. When he was in Gethsemane, he was willing to sacrifice because he wants you at the family reunion. When he was there and the Pharisees attacked and accused him, he was willing to go through it because the goal was to be there in the family reunion with you and me. Now, I find when Jesus talks about this and presents this to us, it's interesting his own perspective about himself. You know the story of the sheep, the lost sheep. Jesus talks about how there's 99 sheep that come back to the fold, but one is lost, and the shepherd goes after that one. But Jesus never tells us how dark the night was, and he never tells us how many thorns and thistles got stepped on along the way. He only tells us the value of the sheep once it's found. When he hath found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he cometh home, he calleth together his friends and neighbors, saying unto them, Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep, which was lost. I say unto you that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons, which need no repentance. Jesus was there in the middle of his sorrow. He was in the hardest of moments when he tells the story not of his sacrifice, but of the joy of you being in eternity with him. And he does it not only in that story. The next one is the lost coin, and in the lost coin, the point of the story is how much joy he gets out of each one of us. And the third story he tells is of the lost child. Some of you have prayed for lost children. Some of you have been lost children. Jesus knows what that experience is like. But he doesn't talk about the agony at night of the father waiting for his son to come back. He doesn't tell about the frustration when the son went and wasted all that the father gave him. No, he tells of the joy when the lost is found. The son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. In solemn repentance, the father responds, Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf, and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Jesus is looking forward to eternity with you. I hope that you will resolve in your heart this morning that that will be your highest priority in life, and that you will sacrifice anything, do anything it takes to be there with him. After all, why would he go through the work of preparing it for you and you throw it away? Why would he prepare the dinner for you if you don't want to eat it? Why would he prepare the mansion in heaven for you if you don't want to fill it? May that be your commitment and my commitment from this moment and forever.